I was listening to the radio the other day, two very erudite people whom I respect, discussing a John Sturges movie.
This was the camp. These were the staggering odds.
There will be no escapes from this camp.
These men plotted. These men dared. These men lived. The Great Escape.
The Great Escape is a classic. It was released in 1963 and single-handedly revived the World War II POW escape movie.
You are about to share every fantastic step of the most daring mass escape ever conceived in the mind of man. Only a hijacked prison train could blast them on their frenzied dash to freedom.
It has been decided that a German national team will play a combined team from the prisoners of war of the occupied territories.
That's crazy.
A stacked game. The Third Reich's finest against a ragged bunch of prisoners of war.
We want you to contact the resistance for us and arrange the escape of the football team.
And The Great Escape has been quoted lovingly in other movies.
10 days isolation Hills.
Captain Hills.
20 days.
Captain Hills.
20 days.
Right. Oh, you'll still be here when I get out.
Cooler.
But the World War II POW camp escape movie hasn't always been like this. The first one was produced by Ealing Film Studios in 1946. The war was still raw in people's minds, and it had a markedly different tone to it.
Celia, your letter has arrived with the photographs. They're in front of me as I write. You asked me to describe our life here so that you may picture it in your imagination. From where I sit, I can hear the sound of a piano. It is my friend Stephen Harley. I wish you could hear this music of his, Celia, for it describes our life here better than I could ever do in words.
The general policy of the Germans seems to have been keep them comfortable, keep them happy, and they won't want to escape. And to a certain extent that's true, because out of 170,000 people held captive in Germany during the war, only 1,200 escaped. That's 0.7% of the captive population. The narrative changed in the 1950s. The tone was more heroic. A series of books came out describing the exploits of escapees from prisoners of war camp, and those books, in turn, were made into films.
It's the same old problem. The longer the tunnel, the longer it takes to dig, and the longer time the goons have to struggle. What we've got to do is start a short tunnel right out here on the city.
3 years later came another exciting story, Albert R.N.
I have an idea, sir. 9 men go out of this room and 8 come back.
There happens to be a count at the main gate.
That, sir, is where Albert comes in.
Do you really think that Albert here would pass muster for a naval officer in broad daylight?
But there's no doubt about it, the most influential book at the time was written by Pat Reed. It was the Colditz story.
Thank you, Captain Tyler.
Thank you, sir.
Wait.
Hoppla! Können Sie nicht sehen, dass die Menschen arbeiten? They're the guards. No soldiers in the world can drill like the guards.
And so too, The Great Escape. And if you don't know the background, it goes back to 1942. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had built an escape-proof camp in Sargen, 100 miles southeast of Berlin, to house the most troublesome Allied airmen they'd shot down and captured. Stalag Luft 3 housed 2,000 RAF personnel, 7,500 from the United States Air Force, and 900 airmen of other nationalities. That'll be a total of 10,000 prisoners in all. The book, The Great Escape, was written by one of the prisoners, Paul Brickell, and he resisted selling the film rights until John Sturges came knocking at his door. The resulting film is pretty accurate in most details, though the camp film set is necessarily smaller than the real thing. The only major inaccuracy is that the American prisoners were moved to an American-only part of the camp, so the Americans weren't actually involved in the escape itself. But in order to raise financing for the film, major Hollywood stars had to be signed, and most of the characters they played were either based on real people or they were composites of real people. James Garner's Hendley the Scrounger was Marcel Zillison, born in Northampton of German parents. Charles Bronson played Danny the Tunnel King. He was in real life Wally Fluddy, who became an advisor on the movie. David McCallum's Eric Ashley Pitt was Flying Officer Peter Fanshawe. Steve McQueen Virgil Hilt's The Cooler King was based on a Texan, William Ashe, who on the night of the actual escape, ironically, was in the cooler. There's one other person who deserves recognition. He's the character played by Richard Attenborough, Roger Bartlett. In fact, he was based on the mastermind of the whole enterprise.
And I think Roger Bushell, the genius who directed all of the British escapes, he had been a fighter pilot, a squadron commander. He was shot down over Dunkirk. He escaped again, and this time he reached Prague and spent a year with a family in Prague. And then the Pragues assassinated Heydrich. And in the sweep up, the Gestapo sweep up through the city, they caught him and the family. The family, of course, were all shot. And he was taken to Berlin and beat up rather severely by the Gestapo. And eventually the Luftwaffe got him back to the camp. But the Gestapo told him, next time you'll be shot, so don't try to escape again. And for a while, it looked like he was going to obey that. But eventually he took over control of all escape, British escape again.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits. Meanwhile, we dig. How many are you taking out? 250. 250?
But things went wrong from the start. It took over an hour to open the tunnel exit because the ground was frozen. And when they finally broke through, the diggers realized there had been a terrible mistake. The tunnel wasn't long enough to reach the safety of the woods.
And nobody knew until the night they were committed, and the tunnel was full of people. When they cracked through the last crust, they were 10 feet short of the woods, which meant they were fairly close to the guards, who fortunately were looking the other way, looking in to the camp, but were so close that those who emerged from the tunnel had to be controlled. Then one would go and get into the woods. That's why only 76 got out instead of the planned 200.
Hitler's first reaction had been to shoot them all. His senior advisors did their best to dissuade him from an act that would break every rule of war. Then shoot more than half, retorted the Fuhrer.
We got out and told the prisoners they should get out and stretch their legs, as we had a long way to go.
He said, I was called to the commandant's office this morning, but he gave me the awful news that of the 76 officers who went out of the tunnel, 50 have been killed.
How many of them were wounded? We ask the names. Officer dead.
Johnny Bull,
Roger Bushell, Mike Casey, Jimmy Cantona, Arnold Preston.
It's somewhat satisfying to know that in the years after the war, every one of those murderers was caught.
They just doggedly kept looking at little pieces of evidence until they finally started finding the smoking gun, and broke the code of saying the Zagan order was deliberate, it was from the highest levels. Eventually they were able to find not only who received the order, but who was given the order to execute it, and they just pursued those to the end until finally they were convinced they had found virtually everybody who was, involved in that effort.
Now, I'm not against World War II movies as such. I've enjoyed Where Eagles Dare, The Dirty Dozen, Guns of Navarone, even Paul Brickell's other books that were turned into films, The Dam Busters and Reach for the Sky. But it's all a matter of tone, isn't it? There's a fine line to be drawn between the shoot-'em-up adventure story and the solemn retelling of history, especially if it involves real people. The Great Escape worked well in 1963, state-of-the-art, wasn't it? But today maybe a sequel's called for, a retelling of what happened after the failed escape. A tribute to the 50 men who were victims of what was a war crime. So after a deep intake of breath, some consideration, I'll happily, if a little uncomfortably, sit down and watch The Great Escape again.